Here on The Colour of Country Life, it's fantastic to be speaking with one of our newest senators for South Australia, the Liberal Party's Kerryn Little. Congratulations, Kerryn.
Thanks very much, Ricky. It's an incredible honour, and certainly understand the responsibility that comes with representing South Australia and South Australians.
Absolutely. And look, just tell us a little bit about yourself by way of background. Where are you from, and particularly what connections have you had with regional South Australia in the past?
Well, I was born and raised in Alice Springs, actually, and for those people in Alice Springs know that Adelaide is just down the road. So I spent a lot of time in Adelaide as a youngster, but my first long-term stay here was when I went off to rural college out at Roseworthy when it was a fully functioning farm, and I've kind of been here pretty much ever since. My first job was at the ABC at Collinswood many, many years ago, and I've, other than a few stints working away, I think this is a great state and I wouldn't work or live anywhere else. I love it.
Yep, that's fantastic to hear. And incidentally, our broadcast centre where I'm sitting right now is in Roseworthy, so there's a lovely little connection there.
Oh, how fantastic. And for you asked me about regional South Australia. I grew up around the cattle industry. My ambition very early on was to be a stock inspector in the period of the brucellosis tuberculosis eradication campaign. I went off and studied that, but I didn't end up doing that. I went into journalism, of course, but certainly issues to do with the land. I've worked in horticultural enterprises, worked as a some people call it gillaroo. We just used to call it working with stock,
yep.
Working with cattle and horses. And so, I have a very long-term interest in regional areas, issues for regional people. My parents still live in a regional centre. So, whether you're a young person or older person, having grown up, I think, in a regional centre means that it's kind of a bit in your DNA. You kind of understand the issues of access to services, access to education, distance, roads, all of those things that are important to people.
Yeah, now we'll give you an open opportunity here really to talk about, what do you think is the major policy issue for South Australia on the federal front, as we now have for the opposition, now that you're in, an Albanese Labor government to deal with. What do you see just for the whole state as the biggest challenge that we're facing?
Well, when I think about cost of living, I automatically go to what are those communities that are differently impacted on cost of living. In a city centre, you've got access to a range of competitive places where you can buy product. In a regional area, you might only have a couple of shops. You've got a greater distance to travel, to go to medical attention, just go about your general business. And so I'll be thinking about how are people in the country affected also by the cost of living issues, which are very serious, and how making sure that given some of the incredible, unprecedented global and domestic factors that have contributed to the pressure that the Australian public is under now, making sure that we're thinking through how do they disproportionately also affect those who are in disadvantaged communities and who are living in regional areas.
Now, you mentioned Alice Springs before. Your now fellow Senator-elect, I should say, Jacinta Price in Northern Territory, she's made reference to your origins in Alice Springs and also saying you have Indigenous heritage, SA's first Indigenous Senator. We got all of that correct?
You certainly have, but as I constantly point out to people, what's important to me is indigeneity is one part of who I am. I've also been a mother, raised two children, now young adults, helped raise a couple of kids who were wards of the state, now adults. I've got a couple of degrees there in business and management, professional qualifications. I've worked across a range of sectors from GP training through to housing affordability, through to the tourism sector. And so I come with a diversity of interests and experiences that I think will contribute well across a whole range of things that reflect the diversity of South Australia. I think it's really important and that people who represent us in the Parliament really understand how things work, so that we're not just talking about what we might all like to see as the change, but we kind of understand a little bit too, and I think that's my strength, how those things actually change at the actual operational and mechanical level.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about bringing a whole lot of things to the table. On your Indigenous heritage, which language group or people group do you originate from, or what have you got? What connectivity do you actually have in the Alice Springs region?
So you talk about Jacinta Price. Jacinta's family, her mother is Warlpiri. Both my parents are Aranda people from Central Australia. We're people from around Alice Springs directly. I've got family who live in Alice Springs, in town camps, in remote communities. So the plethora of, and in metropolitan Adelaide, people who, like myself, have been able to work their way through education, but I did that as an adult with children, so it was not a simple thing to do, is to decide that actually I think I need to get better educated in order to be able to do the things that I want to do. But that's what I decided to do. So for me, things like, if you're from the country, if you're Indigenous, if you're from a multicultural community, if you're just a general Australian, education and a good education is really important. And supporting young people to transition on their pathway through life into employment and into the challenges of just basically making your way from a teenager through to adulthood.
Now, I do want to ask you something about biosecurity in a minute, but Jacinta Price also said she can't wait to work with you about practical outcomes not driven by a woke agenda, saying we don't need a, quote, voice in Parliament when we've got 11 of them in Parliament. I think when you look at the population share, there's some decent representation for people from Indigenous backgrounds.
Yeah, look, I guess, when I think about these things, changing the Constitution does require really careful consideration, and we need to be really clear what we're actually taking to the Australian public. I also want to understand what is the actual impact and change we might see as a consequence of the things that are actually being proposed. Well, I mean, we haven't seen the detail. If you look at the actual statement itself, and surprisingly, when I ask people, have you actually read the statement? Sometimes I get a bit of a blank look. It talks a lot about things that we all want. Of course, we all want those things for Indigenous Australians, but it also talks about a Makarrata. I want to know what that actually means, and I also want to be really clear that the work that is being done in Close the Gap, we can improve a lot of the things that we're currently doing in closing the gap between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, and we need to make sure that the focus that is on constitutional recognition isn't a pathway that unfortunately then reduces the importance of the continued work of closing the gap. Young people coming through today, whether they're 4 years old, 4 months old, or 14 years old, need to know that as they transition through right now, that things will get better for them. Yes. Because it doesn't take long for them to be the next generation.
Absolutely.
And we want to make sure we intervene in this one.
Now, just before we go, you did mention an earlier passion for, I guess, animal welfare in the sense of the livestock industry and your involvement in it. We've spoken with David Littleproud, now the National Party leader, about this work he was doing as Agriculture Minister to have a levy on imports to fund regularly biosecurity amid other things, the concerns about foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease in Indonesia. And our vets have gone over there to help them deal with that, in fact. So do you think that that is something the Labor government needs to crack on with, is continue that work the Coalition had been doing to have a regular funded model to make sure biosecurity is taken care of?
We need to make sure that we protect Australia's industries. When we talk about food security and we talk about the city, where, the groceries come from the nearest store, it comes from somewhere. It comes from food that is produced in healthy environments, with a whole range of compliance and regulatory systems around them. We're known for producing fantastic product here in Australia. Issues such as biodiversity are really important to me and are of interest to me. I remember seeing the devastation when I was a news reporter in Darwin when citrus canker made its way into Darwin. As I said, I was involved in the brucellosis tuberculosis eradication campaign, mustering wild cattle to reduce the risk, pest control, flora, and to protect our native flora and fauna is really, really important to me. And all of those biosecurity issues, I think, must remain a priority for us and for all Australians, because we all benefit from our ecosystem being healthy.
All right, Karen, thanks for joining us today. Look forward to talking to you again with our regional listeners across South Australia.
Thanks, Ricky.